right, thank you all so much for having me. It was a little bit of an ordeal to get here from, live in upstate New York, Western New York, and had to go via Atlanta, and then stay over in Atlanta, of which it was 28 degrees, which coming from Western New York, we had about 8 inches of snow. An evening in Atlanta wouldn't be that bad, but it was colder there than it was at home. So, today I want to talk about strength through all life stages, and if you're having like a flashback to when you were an undergraduate, that like nutrition through the life cycle, it's definitely not that. That's trying not to talk about any of that. No. Part of, like, as Roussel said, I wrote that book, The Strength of Field Manual, and over the last year or so, I've been thinking about like the concept of strength and beyond just maybe physical muscular strength. And really that's what I want to explore today with you all, is that idea, and then how that impacts people at different stages of their lives. So thank you to Iowa Beef and Roussel for having me come out and to be able to speak with you today. I have a couple things before we get into kind of the meat of the talk. I think nutrition is so much. After I graduated from Penn State, so the work I did there was with controlled feeding studies. So that, essentially you give everybody all the food and drinks they're supposed to have, they eat it, they get healthier. Like, it's a pretty simple linear relationship, right? So I left there thinking this whole nutrition thing is not that difficult. And then I entered the world where people don't weigh and measure their food for other people, and just pick up a cooler and eat whatever in it. And realized it's a lot more complicated and it's a lot more confusing, and it's less about milligrams of sodium and more about a lot of other maybe intangible things. And so that's really the lens that I look through nutrition, and how I'm going to help you all is to kind of give you some ideas or strategies, or just kind of provoke you to think a little bit differently to help you engage with people in that way. So a couple ideas to think about to kind of prime you as we get into the talk. There was a study that was done in Germany years ago where they wanted to figure out what are people thinking about. So they gave people pagers, right, which dates the study just a little bit. But these pagers would go off at random times during the day. And when the pager went off, the people were supposed to write down what they were thinking about, and if they were, had some urge that they were thinking about, and if they were actively resisting it. And what they found was that 17% of the time, people are actively resisting urges. And food is actually the number one thing that they're actively resisting. Coffee was number 3, but food is number 1. So I think the thing about nutrition is that I always would tell people that I was trying to help, look, the world is out to get you, right? The world wants you to eat more and move less. And so you are actively resisting all these urges. So then how do we make it a little bit easier? I also like to call it the friction of healthy living. How do we help reduce that friction for people? And this is highlighted by the fact that most of the time people are resisting these urges. Also, nutrition is really confusing. So 52% of consumers said figuring out how to eat a healthy diet is more difficult than completing their tax return. And this would be not the TurboTax, take a picture of your W-2 on your phone and then all of a sudden it gets magically filed. Actually, figuring out your taxes. And I think part of the reason why nutrition is so confusing for people is it's this mixture of, if someone eats food, then they consider themselves a nutrition expert, right? And then they get really passionate about things that they think are important. So it's this mix of fake expertise and this unbridled, misdirected passion, and then all of a sudden people don't know what to do. It makes it very confusing. So how do we, become a really solid voice of reason that's actually going to help people move forward and be healthier, with their lives? So another thing, this is from motivational interviewing, which if anyone's read motivational interviewing or even looked at it and considered reading it, I call it the best book no one's ever finished, right? Because it's about this thick and it's rather dry. But one of my favorite lines from this is that people are reluctant to commit to making a change unless they have some confidence that that change is possible. And I think that's the other thing that if we can do for people is, while the world is out to make them eat more and move less, right? That we can show them there are really simple ways, easy ways, that if we can put into play day after day, that it is possible and this change can be possible. But one of the things where I think nutrition struggles, because I'm sure many, if not all of you have heard this, well, you can find a study to support anything, right? And then, nutritionists don't really know what they're talking about because one day it's, you're not supposed to eat this, and then the next day that exact food is helpful. I mean, I think part of it is, that's science, like we reserve the right to learn more as we go along, right? But there have been this series of unintended consequences, and at the end, we'll circle back to this. So this was a Steve Jobs quote, is that there are unintended consequences for everything. So with nutrition over the years, there's been this variety of unintended consequences. So there was a movement to reduce total dietary fat, right? And so what then that ended up doing was it led to an increase in simple carbohydrates or sugars. And if you've ever heard someone who doesn't know what they're talking about rail against like the dietary guidelines, and you're quick to realize that people don't fully grasp that in the, say, mid-90s, when the dietary guidelines were pushing a lower fat diet approach, right? That it wasn't that made people unhealthy or led to increase in obesity. It was people hearing that and saying, well, I'm gonna go eat Snackwell's cookies, right? That it's everyone's interpretation of what was said, not necessarily the advice itself. Like the Women's Health Initiative is a great example. There was a huge multi-site trial that was looking to look at the effects of a low-fat diet, right? Well, the median low-fat diet being defined as 20% of total calories from fat, right? Well, the average fat intake at the end of that study was 28% calories from fat, right? So that's like, and then there was, a fair amount of media saying the Women's Health Initiative, low-fat diets don't work. It's not that they don't work, it's like literally no one ate a low-fat diet. They're 8% of calories away. But in this world where nutrition is such big media, we don't have that much forgiveness. So we have these unintended consequences. Another thing, reduced dietary saturated fat, right? That led to an increase in trans fatty acids. Reduced dietary cholesterol, right? So we thought that dietary cholesterol was an important part of the diet to reduce risk of heart disease. That led to people eating less eggs and shrimp and other shellfish that would be higher in dietary cholesterol. And so, I always think it's important when we're talking to people about nutritional changes that they're going to make in their lives, that we are also, one, understanding that they know what we're actually telling them, and two, that we're avoiding or minimizing these unintended consequences. And we'll talk about that with respect to protein a little bit. So the meat of kind of what we're going to talk about today is nutrition as a tool for strength, and how do we go about defining strength. And then looking at nutrition, specifically protein's role in strength, both physical strength, mental strength, and then this social emotional strength. So if you were to ask me about nutrition for strength, say 5 years ago, this is probably the answer I would have given you, right? That nutrition is strength, it's protein, it's weightlifting, that's me, there's no other strength we need to worry about, right? But I guess I've come to appreciate that strength is really so much more than how do we just put more weight on a bar. And nutrition really has a lot of power in that. That it's this mix of physical strength, which is important at a variety of levels in your life, mental strength, right? How do we actually use nutrition to support proper cognitive function? And then social emotional strength. People eat, I know 2 humans who eat for calories, right? And one of them, I think everyone in the room will appreciate this. I was at a meeting with GNC, a GNC leadership meeting, and I was actually giving a talk on how to optimize physiology for productivity. But so I was having dinner with some of their regional directors, and there was a guy there, and you can imagine the GNC crowd, it's okay, exactly. All right. So there was this gentleman sitting there when we were in Las Vegas, and he was from Austin, Texas, and he was telling me about, they had this great dinner, and then he had them bring him 3 boiled chicken breasts. And he was telling me about his food, and this guy literally travels. He brought 15 pounds of cooked white fish and chicken on the plane from Austin, Texas to Las Vegas so he could eat it. So there are some people who eat for calories, right? But most people eat for a lot of other reasons that have nothing to do with the caloric value of the food they're eating, right? It has to do with maybe how they feel that food is going to help them, what time of day it is, how they're just feeling, like if they're stressed or anxious or tired or anything like that. Like I had a client once and I would always tell him he'd work really late, and around 11:30 at night he would leave his office and walk down the street and go get a slice of pizza. And I would say, look, nothing good with your diet happens after 11 p.m. So if you find that you're like getting up and leaving the office, like just go home, right? Because it's just, that's how we make, we make food decisions for irrational reasons. So now let's talk about protein's role in physical strength. So protein's role in physical strength, we think about that is muscle protein synthesis. So protein's role in building muscle, you can think of it as two different ways. One way is it flips on the muscle building switch. So there's it's a signaling event where amino acids can tell the body, hey, it's time to build muscle. And then it's also kind of like a building block effect. Think of it as like Legos, like that foods provide these amino acids that actually function as the Legos then to build the muscle. So you're flipping on the switch, but then you're also providing the raw ingredients. So it basically can kind of move in. Leucine turns on the switch through mTOR to drive muscle protein synthesis. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in that process. But that's kind of the direct role of protein in building strength. So there was a research study that was done by Dr. Doug Patton-Jones down at the University of Texas Galveston, the medical branch, and they were looking at how much protein do you need to actually turn on this switch. And what was interesting was I was talking with Doug about this, and he said we've known for years that protein was involved in muscle, but we actually didn't understand how much or what it actually did until he did this research study. So they wanted to look at, well, if you ate a moderate amount of protein or you ate a large amount of protein, how did that impact muscle protein synthesis? How did that impact your body's ability to flip on that switch? And what they found was whether you ate 30 grams of protein, and they gave them lean beef patties, that whether you ate 30 grams of protein or 90 grams of protein, you saw about a 46% increase in muscle protein synthesis. And this is why I think the switch analogy works really well, because when you turn a light switch on, like once it's on, you can't turn it on more, right? And so with this, what this is showing us is that about 30 grams of protein is going to provide your body with enough leucine to turn that switch on. And so I don't have it in here, but the next question people will always ask, right, if you're talking to someone about this, is well, what happens if I eat more than 30 grams of protein, right? That's like always the next question. And I think that's where it's important when we start talking about, well, it's like protein does a couple things. Like it turns on the muscle building switch, right? But it also provides those raw building blocks, and it does a variety of other things. When we get into the mental side of strength, there's some really cool research on protein's function there as well. So then the evolution of that study was, well, if we know that 30 grams of protein is the maximum, is essentially the maximum that an average sized human can consume to then turn on muscle protein synthesis. What happens if we start changing how people eat? So how people generally would eat protein is this skewed distribution. So 11 grams at breakfast, 16 at lunch, and then 63 at dinner. All right, so a small amount of protein early in the day, and then a large amount of protein at dinner. So if you take this, if 30 grams is our target to maximize muscle protein synthesis, and we take this and just say, let's not eat more, but let's just redistribute it so we're eating it more in line with what we know now is physiologically appropriate, what happens? So they took this and a skewed distribution, and then they compared it to people who had this even distribution of protein. So essentially we're taking the same amount of protein, we're not talking about eating more, we're just talking about what we're eating differently. And what they found was you got about a 25% increase in overall muscle protein synthesis over the course of the day. And what I think is really interesting about this is protein's really started to show itself as one of those nutrients that there are time-based benefits to it. Something like vitamin C or fiber. No one's talking about you need 7 grams of fiber at breakfast, 7 grams of fiber at lunch, and then 15 grams of fiber at dinner. There's no temporal effect. But because how amino acids in our body can impact physiology, that there is this importance of how you time your protein to maximize that effect. So there was another study that was looking at people who were overweight and they were trying to lose weight. So they put them on a calorie restricted diet and added resistance training. And then they switched this skewed to even protein distribution to see if there was an effect on body composition. So if we had an effect in muscle protein synthesis, which is like the nerd effect, right? Like what's the real world effect? Like did these people get leaner or, more lean body mass? And what they found was they actually didn't find a change whether you're eating skewed distribution or even distribution on body composition when you were including resistance training in a weight loss regimen. So it's not that, I interpret that as it's not necessarily that this phenomenon isn't still there, but I think that the physiological impact of resistance training and its ability to stimulate muscle protein synthesis and its ability to preserve muscle is so strong that it's almost like an overriding factor. But, as you know, a lot of people don't lift weights 3 or 4 days a week, right? So this is a really valid strategy, especially for people as they get older. So as we move and talk about strength and kind of move through the life cycle, talk about the role of protein and strength as you get older. And so if there, couldn't be a more iconic figure, Jack LaLanne in strength, that's actually Jack LaLanne earlier in life and then him again later in life. And he was like an amazing individual, and I think he was also a hallmark example of like Father Time always wins. No matter how healthy you are, no matter how many times you want to like swim across the San Francisco Bay, tugging a boat full of people on a chain by your teeth, right? Because he did that on like his 60th birthday or something. That you can't, your aging wins. But there's a lot that we can do to slow that down. So talk about sarcopenia. So sarcopenia, a muscle disease characterized by low muscle strength, mass, and function, and is associated with an increased risk of functional decline, frailty, hospitalization, and death, which is a pretty depressing definition. But I think it also shows important, that lean body mass is something I don't think we've really appreciated the importance of it throughout life. Like the GNC crowd totally appreciates it, right? But, for like my parents, definitely don't really appreciate the importance of that. And especially, as people generally by default live more and more sedentary lifestyles. So this slide is both wonderful and horrifying. So the pictures of these women, it's so terrible, and I included it because it was so terrible. So I was trying to find, I need a picture of like active older women, right? And so like this is the stock photo websites, like this is what they come up with. I don't even know what these women are doing. It's like I don't know what they're doing. They're like looking at the sun behind a cloud, fully make-ups, like while doing aerobics with Jane Fonda. It's so bad. So I included this picture more for your humor, because so we need more older people exercising in stock photos. Yeah. But and in real life. But I think not what I think, but the actual important message here is, aging is happening, and if we're not actively pushing against it, the additive effects over the years have a real negative impact. So if we think of an annual loss of muscle strength, 1-2%, and then strength of 1.5 to 5% after 50 is pretty significant. When you couple that with the fact that, around 30 is when you can start, it becomes a lot harder to build muscle after 30 years old. So like older in protein research is 30, which is super depressing. But, this is, and 1% strength, not that big of a deal. But if that gets compounded year after year after year, Doug Patton-Jones, he talks about this, that muscle loss over time, it's not a linear occurrence, right? That it isn't actually 1% year after year. But what happens is, maybe you fall, and you don't have sufficient muscle mass, so you can't catch yourself. So you fall and you get injured. And then you're sedentary for 6 months, right? Because you're injured. So you have this intense loss of muscle mass. And what other, I don't have it on here, I should have included it, but what other data is done, and actually I think Duggan did this, it was looking at sedentary individuals young, so in their 20s versus in their 60s. And a sedentary individual in their 20s would have to basically be sedentary for 3 weeks, right? So essentially all of March Madness. So think of like the 20-year-olds who like sit and watch basketball for a whole month. The amount of muscle mass they lose is the same that someone older in life loses in less than a week. So just a couple days. And then, so there's the fall you get injured, and then you're sedentary for 6 months. So you have this tremendous muscle mass loss. And then, let's say later that year, you end up getting the flu. You get hospitalized, right? So you're sedentary again. You go home, you're even more sedentary, because you're weakened from the flu, so you're going to be sedentary some more. So it's these like sarcopenic events that are going to accelerate, muscle loss. And so nutrition, if you think of that 25% increase in muscle protein synthesis every day, that sounds like a tremendous effect, but it's really more just a buffer what happens to us in everyday life, and that's why it's so important. And sorry, this definitely got skewed in transfer of computers, but why does muscle mass matter? So when you have a decrease in muscle mass, you get an increase in fractures, functional decline, cognitive decline, cardiac disease, respiratory disease, a decrease in quality of life, a decrease, these arrows are shifted, so if I'm saying something opposite, that's why. A decrease in independence and also an increase in hospitalization. So if I was like really good at this point, I would sell you some magic muscle building pill because I've thoroughly scared you about the effects of aging and muscle loss. But I think we'll talk about the best muscle building pills, probably just protein and exercise. So one of the things that we can do here to help people counteract this is to help them meet increased protein needs. So as you get older, you get a little bit of an amino acid resistance. So, while a 25-year-old could actually get away with about 20 to 25 grams of protein to maximize muscle protein synthesis, someone older in life might need 30 to 35. So you're gonna need a little bit more protein. We also need to combat this idea of the anorexia of aging. So that as we get older, we just can have a reduction in appetite, and it's hard to eat all the food that needs to be eaten. And so, looking at the foods that efficiently deliver essential amino acids is really important. We can optimize protein timing and then also pair it with exercise. Eat less than 3 hours a week of exercise. And this is really why exercise is so important. So exercise is going to decrease insulin resistance. It increases the muscle response to anabolic stimuli, so your muscles become basically sensitized to those muscle building signals. You get a further increase in muscle protein synthesis, I'll show you that in just a second, increase in lean body mass, and an increase in strength, even if you are 100 years old. There's this great study looking at 100-year-old individuals and engaging them in resistance training and showing how they can experience increases in strength. Because what's interesting, if you remember about the definition of sarcopenia, it wasn't just about muscle mass, it was also about muscle strength. And you can get stronger without necessarily getting bigger because of neuromuscular efficiencies that you get. So, that's really a quick win for people, is you can get stronger a lot faster, you don't necessarily have to get bigger. And side effects are going to include improved mood and improved social interactions. So it's an overall win. And then if you combine protein and exercise, so you get an even greater effect. So here there's like a basal level where it says inactivity, there's like a basal level of muscle protein synthesis. And then if you add exercise itself stimulates your body's ability to rebuild and regrow muscle, right? Which makes sense because exercise breaks it all down, and then your body's gonna be signaled to then build it back up. This wanes after about 3 hours. If you combine exercise and protein, you get an even stronger effect, and then it's sustained for even longer. So protein and exercise together are going to give you a better bang for your buck when it comes to both exercise and protein with respect to muscle protein synthesis. So now we're going to transition to the role of nutrition's role in mental strength. So when it comes to growth and cognitive development, what I think is interesting about, there was a shift years ago in especially dietary guidance, moving away from individual nutrients to food-based guidance, right? Which makes a lot of sense. I've never met someone who can quantify the amount of sodium they eat on a daily basis. And so getting people focusing on foods is really important. And when it comes to growth and cognitive development, protein-rich foods can be a great vehicle, not just for protein, but key nutrients that help with cognitive growth and development, such as zinc, selenium, a variety of B vitamins, iron, and then also vitamin B12. And now when it comes to kids, the delivery, using protein-rich foods as a means of providing additional nutrients is really important, because this is what people 2 to 18 are eating, right? And so if we go here and we remove the protein-rich foods, we're basically left with fruit drinks and AIDS. AIDS is an official term. Candy, sugary foods, soft drinks, crackers, chips, pretzels, breads and rolls, and cakes, cookies, and pies. It's kind of a bleak, view of the diet of a 6-year-old. But it's true. I mean, I have a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, and 2 11-year-olds. And I think if left unchecked, this would probably be their diet. So, the importance of protein foods, and if we think of that protein timing, looking to get them to have protein at every eating occasion, that it's going to increase the overall nutrient richness of their diet as well. So this graph here, we're going to transition now from younger kids to a little bit older and how protein can impact brain function and also our ability to eat. So this is a really cool study where they wanted to look at people eating a normal, a normal protein diet, which say about like the RDA protein, or maybe about 15% of calories from protein, and then moving them up to a moderate, about 30% calories from protein diet. So what they did was they standardized them to a normal protein diet initially, and then a high protein diet, and then they said, okay, you can eat as much as you want, but you just have to keep it in these proportions of the moderate protein diet. So it's like ad libitum, yet still controlled. And what they found was those individuals then on average ate about 441 calories less per day. And so this is really directly speaking, then you can see on the bottom, you can see that how their weight decreased as well. So this is really speaking to the satiating effects of protein. So if we go back and we were talking about, when you're talking to someone and say, well, 30 grams of protein, about a palm-sized piece of protein is what you need to maximize muscle protein synthesis. And then they say to you, well, what happens if I eat more, right? What happens is that's really where the satiating effect of protein kicks in. So the satiating effect of protein is more dose response. So the more protein that you eat, the more satiated you're gonna be. So if anyone has ever sat down and tried to eat a whole rotisserie chicken from Costco, just theoretically, right? By the time you hit like 2 chicken breasts and 1 thigh, like you're pretty satiated. So there's definitely a dose response in the satiating effects of protein. And so why this has to do with how protein interacts a lot with your brain. Well, a lot with your gut and then your brain, because protein triggers signals from your gut, which then travel up to your brain. So your body has a variety of signals that tell you when you're full, but only one that tells you when you're hungry. So ghrelin is your only hunger hormone. And protein is going to decrease ghrelin. And then protein also will increase things like PYY, GLP-1, and CCK, which those are satiating hormones and signaling molecules. So you get a decrease in hunger signals, and you also get an increase in satiety signals. Another thing, and this is so cool to me, that protein actually can impact reward-driven eating. So reward-driven eating is exactly like it sounds. Reward-driven eating is you see, pizza, or you see some cookies, and your brain's like, that looks good, I think I'll have some, right? Think of it as the opposite effect when your brain sees kale, right? It's like the total opposite. But reward-driven eating is not necessarily a phenomenon that has to do with how much you've eaten, right? It's really a brain-driven thing. And this was a research study that was done by Dr. Heather Leidy when she was at University of Missouri, And so they looked at breakfast, and this is like so crazy if you think about it. They gave people breakfast, either 35 grams of protein, which is a high protein breakfast, 13 grams of protein, which was a normal protein breakfast, or they had them skip breakfast, right? And then they looked at their brain function in the afternoon. So this is hours later. And they laid them down on a functional MRI, and they showed them pictures. It was like cats, sunsets, pizza, hugs, football game, cookies, french fries, chips, so they would move in these reward-driven foods. And then they would monitor how their brain responded. And what they found was they saw the people who ate the high protein breakfast had the greatest reductions in reward center activation when they were shown these reward-driven foods. Then, in order to make this the coolest research study ever, they gave them a cooler full of snacks that they were basically allowed to eat as much as they wanted. And the people who had the high protein breakfast ate less snacks in the evening, and they had lower levels of ghrelin and higher levels of the satiety hormone, PYY. So it's just amazing to think that eating protein at breakfast can impact not just how your brain looks at delicious foods later in the day, but also your eating behaviors later in the day as well. So now I'm going to transition from interesting things about nutrition in the brain to depressing things about your brain as we talk about dementia. So dementia is a group of symptoms that's characterized by difficulties with memory, language, problem solving, and other cognitive skills. This is not generally something that we've historically thought nutrition could be helpful for, but it's becoming a much bigger issue. The other day I was reading some AARP survey data that people listed dementia or losing their cognitive abilities as they were more scared of that than dying, right? So it's a huge issue. It's something that people are concerned about, and it's also something that nutrition can really have a powerful impact on. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia. 60 to 80% of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. There's not like a test that you can take for it. It's more of a pathology, a specific neuropathology that is characterized by this accumulation of beta amyloid plaques. Some interesting statistics about Alzheimer's disease. So every 65 seconds in the US, someone develops Alzheimer's disease. 15 to 20% of people 65 plus have mild cognitive impairment, and they expect a 35% increase in people with Alzheimer's disease by 2050. So this is kind of a bigger problem that's just getting bigger. But what's really cool is a couple years ago it was a DASH spin-off study. So I think there's one thing that nutrition researchers love to do. Well, it's two things. One, acronyms, right? And two, spin-offs of the DASH diet. My PhD work was a spin-off of the DASH diet, so I can say that from personal experience. So the MIND diet is Mediterranean DASH intervention for neurodegenerative delay. And what it was a 3-year clinical study that was applied essentially a mix between a DASH diet and a Mediterranean diet to reduce risk of Alzheimer's disease. 53% of people who vigilantly followed the diet saw significant reductions in their risk of Alzheimer's disease. But there was a 35% reduction in risk of Alzheimer's disease in people who had moderate adherence. That's the money line in my book, because nobody is vigorously adherent to any diet, right? It's moderate at best. And so if you could tell someone, look, you could be average and still get a 35% reduction in risk of Alzheimer's disease, that's exciting. I mean, they would see 50%. They're like, I'm doing it. But 2 weeks into it, they would be really happy with 35%. So what I really like about the MIND diet is it's really simple stuff. It's not like you need your PhD for sort of stuff. It's eat one salad a day, right? Eat one serving of other vegetables, one serving of nuts, 2 or more servings of berries weekly. And they put an emphasis on blueberries due to some of the research showing the additional cognitive benefits of blueberries. 3 servings of whole grains daily, 2 to 3 servings of beans weekly, 1 or more servings of fish, 2 or more servings of poultry. Olive oil was used as the primary oil, and then they save the best for last. You have a glass of wine every day, right? So as we read through this list, this isn't This isn't rocket science. This is really basic stuff that is, as it describes, it's the DASH diet mixed with the Mediterranean diet. That really shows if you can consistently put into practice the basics, it can have a profound effect on, generally we think cardiovascular health, body weight, but also your mental and your cognitive health. And so I think the mind diet is a greatly underrated thing that we can talk more about as nutrition professionals. So the last part, we're going to transition to the role, nutrition's role in social and emotional strength. So one of the things that's really interesting, as I was talking about earlier, is that people don't eat food just for calories. They eat foods for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that I think is so great about nutrition and food is how it can bring us all together. And so one of the areas that I've always been very interested in is that effect of eating together, because there is something additional there, and especially if you look at family meals. So this was a study that was done, it was actually done in Canada, but by researchers at Penn State, and they talked to parents when their children were 6 years old to find out their family eating habits, so were they eating family meals together or not. And then they followed those kids, and then at 10 years old, they did assessments of those children. And they found that the children who were parts of families who ate family meals on a regular basis had greater levels of general fitness, lower levels of soft drink consumption, lower levels of physical aggression, lower levels of non-aggressive delinquency, and lower levels of reactive aggression. So, this is bringing together not even what's the nutrients in the food, but what the food is bringing us together to do is showing improvements in these kids from when they were 6 to when they were 10. Then this continues to persist older in adolescence. So this was looking at, again, family meals, but in adolescence. And what they found in this study was 1,500 families, and they found that about 30% of the families had shared meals at least 7 times a week together. And for the children, the adolescents, who were in families who shared frequent family meals, those children had lower levels of tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana use. Not a decrease in low grade point average, but it was an increase, reduced, it was a reduced occurrence of low grade point averages, decrease in depressive symptoms, and a decrease in suicide involvement and suicidal thoughts. And this was also, these effects were more pronounced in adolescent girls than adolescent boys, but the effects were significant across both gender groups. And so again, this is just as simple as, let's eat together. In older individuals, this was a study that was done in Japan, looking at eating alone and its relationship to depression. And so they found that eating alone was strongly associated with depressive symptoms in community-dwelling elderly individuals. That the relationship was actually stronger with people who lived with family but then ate alone. And this was surprising to me, was that it was stronger in younger being defined here as 69 years old compared to 79 years old, and less mentally frail. So people who were younger and less mentally frail were more susceptible to the depressive effects of eating alone, which I think was a little counterintuitive as I was going over this. But one of the things that is interesting about nutrition, I think, is that it goes both ways. So that, there is this eating together, the sharing of food, this community aspect of it that strengthens social emotional strength. But that how we look at food also impacts our own personal social emotional strength. And so to highlight that, I want to just go over, talk about one of my favorite research studies. And it has to do with this idea of counter-regulatory eating, or also called the what the heck effect. So I can tell you, when I gave this talk when I was with the GNC people not too long ago, I've never had a concept like ring more true to a crowd than this idea, right? So counter-regulatory eating happens with someone who's a restrained eater. So restrained eaters demonstrate counter-regulatory eating behaviors when anxious or stressed. So by counter-regulatory, it's basically that if you overeat, right, then the logical, and I will say humans are anything but logical, step would be at your subsequent meal you would undereat. And so counter-regulatory eating is that at your subsequent meal you actually then overeat, partly because you're upset about the initial overeating occasion. So this is, I'll take a little bit of, so this is from the movie Elf, right? And I've had to like move up my movie references over the years because this is from another talk. Does anybody know what this movie is from? Beverly Hills Cop. Thank you so much. I almost had to stop using this slide because I gave it like once and no one knew what the reference is. I was like, wow, okay. I know it was from the 80s, but so this is a left turn, but it's relevant because of the movie reference. And like, has anyone ever heard the idea that you have all this undigested meat in your digestive system? Like in your intestines, you have all this. And so I was doing a talk once on protein myths, and I'm like, well, there's a good protein myth. Like, I need to get to the bottom of this. And so I spent all this time like trying to figure out where did this come from? Where did this come from? This is literally where that idea came from. The early, and I can tell you I spent much more time on this than I should have. The earliest reference I can ever find to this idea of undigested meat sitting in your digestive tract comes from Billy Rosewood in Beverly Hills Cop. They're sitting in a car waiting for Eddie Murphy to come out of the Beverly Hills Hotel. He's reading a newspaper and he says, wow, you know what it says here? That by the time the average American is 50, he's got 5 pounds of undigested red meat in his bowels. It's just, I mean, you all appreciate the madness that is the media and people try to make reasonable nutrition decisions. And this is what we're dealing with. You know, if it's said enough, people forget it was Billy Rosewood and they think it's actually scientific fact. So about this idea of counter-regulatory eating and self-compassion. This is really cool. So this was a study, and also if I had to go back in graduate school, I would go back as a psychology graduate student because they can literally do whatever they want. Like, when we like went to the IRB for my doctorate work, which is basically we were looking at variations of the DASH diet and incorporating lean beef into a DASH diet. We had to improve the average American diet because it was seen as too unhealthy, right? And then like we weren't doing anything different. This is just how normal humans eat. And these, I mean, if you're a psychology graduate student, you can just flat out lie to people. So this study is the perfect example. So in this study, they recruited college-age women, and they told them they needed them to come in for a candy taste test, right? So they sat them down in this one room with a TV and had a plate of donuts. And they said, hey, we're gonna get the taste testing ready. Why don't you sit here and watch this pre-video so you understand what you're doing. And there are some donuts here as well that you can eat if you want. So then they left them there for a little bit, then they walked them down the hallway, and then they brought them to another room where they had all this candy that they could taste test. And they were told they eat as much candy as they want and then fill out a survey, which was probably just got shredded right afterwards. Because they're lying to them all the time. But what was really interesting about this study was they took these college students, and as they were walking them down the hallway, this is where they did the intervention, was they had a conversation with them, and I literally have pasted all the text because it's worth reading, and about what they said to these people and how it impacted food consumption. So this is the researcher, right, walking down the hallway with the person who was just exposed to a delicious plate of donuts and a commercial. So it says, you might wonder why we picked donuts to use in this study. It's because people sometimes eat unhealthy sweet foods while they're watching TV. We thought it would be more like the real world to have people eat a dessert or junk food. But several people have told me that they feel bad about eating donuts in this study, so I hope you won't be too hard on yourself. Everyone eats unhealthy sometimes, and everyone in this study eats this stuff, so I don't think there's any reason to feel bad about this. This is a little amount of food, and it doesn't matter anyway. And then it says, just wait a second and I'll bring you the questionnaire, right? Because they gotta pretend it's somewhat realistic. But what was really interesting, so the people that had that conversation with the researcher in the hallway moving to this next section ate 2.5 times less calories from candy during their fake candy taste test versus the people who just had to wallow in their own sorrows as they walk down the hall in silence, right? But that this idea of self-compassion, which is what those 3 slides, what the researcher was trying to get at for the participant, that self-compassion led to non-dieting behavior, which would be if you eat something, you just eat a little bit less later on. Whereas traditional restrained eating with diet behavior would be you eat something you don't want to and then you eat more subsequently. So I think it's really interesting, this idea of nutrition and social emotional health, like it goes both ways, is that we can use nutrition in our eating occasions and how we gather around food together to improve it, but then also how we help clients or patients think to themselves about their own foods and how it makes them feel can also impact how they make food decisions. And that's really cool. I think that's really powerful. So as kind of a summary, this idea of strength is not limited to just the traditional definition of physical muscular strength, but it also extends to mental and social emotional strength. And nutrition really plays a key role in all of these areas. Now, when I was talking about protein, all of the different protein studies and examples that we were talking about was giving people protein above what would be considered the RDA, right? And so here is a list showing intake data, and then also if you look at the AMDRs, the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, so kind of the range looking at percent calories that's deemed healthful. This kind of 20 to 25% is where protein researchers think is the optimal range for people to eat. And that would be the optimal range of the kind of the protein intakes that we were talking about in a lot of these studies. But you can see where people are currently eating is well below the optimal range. So no one's worried about generally amino acid deficiencies, but we are still a little bit far from optimal. And so if we go back to that idea of unintended consequences, right, is that if our recommendation is focused on the essential requirement of amino acids, right, which is what the RDA is, then like what is the end result? Like we're sort of missing out on this whole realm of protein and its benefits that we could get at this optimal range. And then if we're also looking at protein-based recommendations, not meal-based recommendations, then what's the other thing that we're missing out on? And so I don't really have faith on like the government actually changing, recommendations, and I think that the RDAs are important for what they are, but I think as nutrition professionals, we should, interpret, that the RDAs are what they are, and therefore presenting deficiencies in 95 to 96% of the population. But then how do we actually need to translate optimal intakes to the people that we're working with? And then do we want to take a more meal-based approach versus just looking at getting enough protein throughout the day? So then a quick summary about things that we talked about. Moderate amounts of protein, evenly timed throughout the day, support optimal muscle protein synthesis. That if we combine protein and exercise, it really strengthens our body's ability to build and repair muscle, and this is important, especially the older that you get. The addition, protein has a unique impact on brain function, but protein-rich foods also contain key nutrients that are important for brain function and development, and that nutrition interventions like the MIND diet can actually significantly impact cognitive health later in life. Sharing meals together improves behaviors associated with robust social and emotional health, and how we experience eating, especially with more and more meals being eaten out of the home, and more meals being eaten in front of a screen with headphones on. That what are we missing out at when it comes to those family meal times or sharing those meals together? So that's all I have for you all today. And then we have a couple minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer that. Okay.
I do. So with the protein time, you said after 3 hours of resistance training, the muscle building kind of stops. But if you do add protein and strength training, then it's 5 hours.
Yep.
So is the time, do you have to eat, I'm thinking I've been reading that the protein timing after exercise, because we always used to say like within, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, like
Yep.
that. But now it's more of like just having protein, in your body, like the amount of protein that's available in your body. So is the 5 hours if you eat protein right after exercise, or just if you have an adequate amount in your system? Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, you're making sense. So then like 30 to 60 minutes is more actually about glycogen replenishment. So your ability to replenish glycogen stores decreases significantly after 60 minutes. For the average person, let's say, who's exercising 3 times a week, like replenishing their muscle glycogen instantly after exercise is not a huge problem. But that's just the 3 and 5 hours is just where the signals are stronger. And so if you ate, say, an hour and a half before you exercise, and you eat solid food, those amino acids will get digested and peak in your bloodstream kind of at the right time post-exercise anyway. So you are right in that it's almost having that protein in your system, whether it's from a before exercise or after exercise. I think where sometimes where we go wrong is people go protein crazy, where they're like, well, I have to have this protein shake or I have to do this. 5 hours is a pretty good amount of time. Like if you work out at 4 o'clock, like just eat before 9. Is a pretty simple recommendation.
I was wondering about the exercise component. I guess my background, I work with a lot of older people. I'm a caregiver, and there's not a lot of motion during the day, mostly sitting, not much moving. And I wondered, is there exercise recommendations or in the studies, what kind of things are people doing? Are they walking long distances? They walk a lap around the house, maybe it takes them 5 or 10 minutes. Is that effective along with the protein intake?
Yeah, so the good news about exercise is it scales really well with your level of fitness. And this is really shown with like insulin sensitivity too. So that if you are rather sedentary, walking around the house, or exercise is relative from an exertion level. So from sitting all the time to just walking, like you said, it takes 5 or 10 minutes to walk around the house, that's going to be a significant level of exertion. In the study with the 100-year-old individuals, 90% sure it was just resistance bands. So it was seated in chairs, like resistance band type training. So the level of intensity scales with your level of fitness. So it's not like you need to go to the gym and start squats and clean and things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that an older person was sedentary for a couple days. They would lose the same muscle mass as a younger person would for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Why is that?
So it has to do with a decreased in the anabolic nature. Like the younger individual can maximize muscle protein synthesis with 20 grams, and it takes an older individual 30 to 40. It's that sensitivity to the anabolic signals is a big driver. As you get older, you actually get an increase in muscle breakdown. So it's a two-sided coin. There's a reduction in stimulus of muscle protein synthesis, but there's also an acceleration of muscle breakdown as well.
Okay.
So it's kind of both of those things.
Thanks.
And that research, it was Doug Patton-Jones, if you want to look it up.
Okay.
That was looking at those sedentary differences.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you all so much. I'll be around if anyone has